Hello audience and welcome to a reading corner. For this video we'll be covering Cloak and Dagger, also known as the Teenage Runaways, Tandy Bowen and Tyrone Johnson, who were exposed to I'm not reading that bit, so basically these are the next two characters for the Marvel Rivals lineup, and when I say two, they're actually one character but they're interchangeable. So this story we are covering is titled A Brief Farewell. The back alleys of New York City had never been safe. Back when Tyrone Johnson and Tandy Bowen were just teenage runaways, they'd found themselves fighting to survive the cruel realities of living on the streets. When they gained their superpowers, becoming a crime-fighting duo known as Cloak and Dagger, they vowed to shed a little light and darkness on the most dangerous corners of the city so that no one else would ever have to live in fear again. But now, fear had taken over, not just in the alleys, but across the entire island of Manhattan. Dracula, the Lord of Vampires, had come to town and had somehow managed to lock the Big Apple in a state of eternal night. His blood-sucking minions were on a rampage, and there was only a few heroes left to protect the innocent citizens of New York City from being involuntarily drafted into the vampire army's ranks. "Watch out, Ty!" Dagger yelled. "On your left!" "I see him, Tandy," Cloak replied, returning to face the three vampires that were rushing towards him, their teeth bared in a bloodthirsty frenzy. Cloak opened his billowing cape, revealing the pure darkness shrouded within. "Chew on this, boys," Cloak said as three ebony trails reached out of the void and ensnared the unsuspecting vamps. They struggled to break free, but to no avail. The vampires were pulled into the living portal into the Dark Force dimension that was where Cloak's body should have been. As they disappeared into the pitch black, Cloak smiled, knowing what went in rarely came back out. "You let them off easy. Again," Dagger said, her voice echoing in Cloak's mind. "You do know vampires thrive in the dark, right?" "Sorry," Cloak said, growing annoyed by Dagger's constant critiquing. "Fresh out of light. Maybe if you were here you could have finished them off, like you do. But tonight's my night, remember?" "Yeah," Dagger replied, with a deep sadness that Cloak could feel in his own soul. "How could I forget?" Cloak breathed a heavy sigh. His partner wasn't the only one who was struggling with their current status quo. Shortly before the creatures of the night had seized the city, Cloak and Dagger were on a routine mission busting some smugglers on the Lower East Side when the world turned upside down. Or miraculously, in their case, inside out. Normally, a few petty criminals would never have stood a chance against a pair of seasoned superheroes like Cloak and Dagger. But during the fight, something strange happened. A burst of light appeared in the sky, brighter than anything Dagger had ever conjured up with her light force powers. As it washed over the city, Dagger instinctively leapt into Cloak's portal and the two teleported away to safety, as they had done countless times before. Cloak emerged shortly after, safe and sound, but when he opened the folds of his cape, Dagger didn't follow. Cloak feared that his partner had become lost in the Dark Force dimension, but those fears were quickly negated when he heard Tandy's voice in his head as clear as day. She was there with him, but at the same time she wasn't. Cloak opened himself up to it again, straining with all his might as he tried to summon Dagger's physical form through the portal with him. Suddenly, the beams of pure light force erupted from Cloak's body, as he let out an anguished scream, and, where he had just stood, Dagger had taken his place. But now Cloak was gone, and yet he wasn't. If he had been thrust into the Dark Force dimension, he could have easily navigated his way back out, but this was something else entirely. It was as if Cloak was looking at the world through Dagger's eyes. Baffled by what had happened to him, Dagger sought out the help of a trusted friend, Reed Richards, the brilliant scientist and superhero known as Mr. Fantastic. Reed told him that the bright light they had seen in the sky was caused by a massive disruption in the fabric of space-time itself, an event that he was calling the time-stream entanglement. The cosmic disturbance had cascaded across multiple dimensions, leading to all sorts of unusual effects, such as causing some alternate realities to merge into one. He summarised that since Cloak and Dagger happened to be travelling between dimensions together when the time stream entanglement struck their reality, they themselves had somehow become entangled with one another on a molecular level. Now they seemed to exist in the same material space, and only one of them could occupy it at any given time. Curiously, even when one of them was physically absent, the consciousness remained fully present within the mind of a predominant partner. That'll explain why you've only got the two of them. They don't appear in the game, but you can swap between the two of them. Reed ran a number of tests in hoping of finding a solution to the duo's dilemma, but nothing seemed to work. He promised the young heroes that he wouldn't give up, but for now, they would have to make the best of their new situation. Cloak mused that Dagger had always been the angel on his shoulder over the many years they had been partners, The fact that she was now quite literally a voice inside his head and nothing more was going to take some time to get used to. Unfortunately, even more change was on the horizon than he had initially realised. When the vampires took control of Manhattan, the heroes tried to go about their business as usual. At first, Dagger wanted nothing more than to use her life force energy to heal those who had been infected by Dracula's curse. Meanwhile, Cloak wasn't nearly as forgiving to the sinister creatures that had overrun his city. But as time went by, Dagger became more aggressive in her attacks against the vampires, while Cloak had a tendency to show more mercy to the poor people who had fallen under Dracula's sway. Their traditional roles were reversing, giving Cloak a reason for concern. To make matters worse, there was a rift growing between their fellow heroes as well. Reed Richards was determined to cure the city of Dracula's curse with as little collateral damage as possible. He knew that many of the vampires stalking the streets had been innocent civilians when all this began, and he wanted to do whatever it took to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. But Tony Stark and his ally Moon Knight had learned of a more permanent means of removing the vampire threat in one fell swoop. Cloak could feel that Dagger was beginning to lean towards that more extreme option, and it scared him to see her once unwavering light beginning to flicker. "Tandy," Cloak said, finally working up the courage to confront his partner about their descent towards the darkness. "We've got to talk." "No," Dagger replied. "We've got to fight. We don't have time to worry about feelings, Ty. This is war. When are you going to finally man up and act like it?" Cloak paused, trying to keep his temper in check. He had known Tandy for so long, but it was almost like he didn't know her at all anymore. Was this his fault, he wondered? Could her shift in demeanour have been caused by prolonged exposure to the dark force energies that Cloak himself had barely learned to control, even after all these years? Dagger's light had always been a force that guided him. What if it was finally snuffed out and he was to blame? Cloak's concerns would have to wait. He had just received a message from Reed Richards, asking him to come back to the Baxter building, which the heroes had been using as a stronghold since the vampiric invasion. In a blink, Cloak teleported away. Moments later, Dagger materialized in the Baxter building. During the teleportation process, Tandy had exerted her will and taken control of their shared physical form for herself. Cloak was less than thrilled, but he chose to remain silent and to observe, for now. "What's the deal, Reed?" Dagger asked, showing a touch of impatience. "You know we're way more help out in the streets than we're here in your lab, right?" "Indeed," Reed said. "You are needed on the front lines, but I think we both can agree that it would be better if there were two of you fighting this fight instead of just one." "What are you saying?" Dagger asked, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. "As you know, Tony and I have been designing technology that may be capable of repairing the time stream," Reed said. "This time stream integrating device could undo the damage caused by the time stream entanglement and restore this reality, and countless others, to its original state." "Do you think it could do the same thing for me and Cloak?" Dagger asked, jumping straight to the point. "In theory," Reed said. "The problem is we haven't yet located an adequate source of chronovium to power the TRD, and a failed trial run could set us back months, a risk that Tony is not willing to take. However," Reed stretched his elastic-like arm over his workbench, about 10 feet away. He grabbed hold of a small, high-tech device and retracted his limb back to its normal proportions. He held up the device for Dagger and Cloak to see. "This is a portable version of a TRD that I've been tinkering with," Reed continued. "It's not capable of realigning entire realities, but perhaps it could handle recalibrating something else that had become entangled. Something on a slightly smaller scale." "Tandy," Cloak said, hesitantly within the mind of his partner. "I really don't want to be a guinea pig in another experiment. I think we should wait and—" "We're in," Dagger said, completely dismissing Cloak's concern. "Good," Reed said, placing a small shard of chronovium crystal in the handheld device. "Now, stay very still, and try not to scream too loud. Franklin and Valeria are sleeping upstairs." If somebody asks you not to scream during an experiment, you know it's not going to be good. As the device activated, it bathed Tandy in a crackling cascade of energy. She grimaced in pain, feeling as though she was being ripped in half. And in essence, she was. The device was extracting Cloak's molecules from her own in hopes of allowing both young heroes to live as separate beings for the first time in ages. When the energy faded, Dagger still remained, and Cloak stood by her side. "He did it!" Dagger exclaimed, wrapping her arms around her partner in glee. "Yeah, great," Cloak said, clearly less enthusiastic about the process. Part of it was because Dagger had gone against his direct wishes, but Cloak also had a deep fear that he would no longer be able to keep his partner's emerging darkness under check now that they were separated. Richard said, putting a hand to his chin as he studied the readings on his handheld TRD. That's strange. What's wrong? Dagger asked nervously. It worked, didn't it? Mostly, Reed replied. Even though you once again exist simultaneously within the same physical plane, it seems as though your energy signatures are still deeply intertwined. What's that mean, big brain? Cloak asked. It means the change may not be permanent, Reed said, dismayed. If you were to activate the same conditions that triggered the initial molecular fusion, I'm afraid you are more than likely to revert to your shared state. So, no more teleporting then? Dagger asked. Works for me. Hey, but that's my whole thing, Cloak replied. Not anymore, partner, Dagger said. You can do lots of other stuff with your Dark Force, right? Great creative. Hey, guess I can figure something out, Cloak said, uncertain. Looks like you're going to have to figure it out much sooner than anticipated, Reed interrupted. Ben just reported in from his transport mission, and he says he's located a cluster of vampires attacking some citizens near Battery Park. No sweat, we'll be there in... Cloak started to say, but then he paused as Dagger shot him a dirty look. He realised that they could no longer travel between locations in split seconds via the Dark Force dimension. Could we borrow a Fantasticar? Soon, Cloak and Dagger landed their borrowed vehicle on the southern tip of Manhattan. The two heroes stepped off and began to scout the area for any sign of vampires. Now this is more like it, Dagger said. Just like the old days. Yeah, Cloak agreed. Except for that part. Dagger looked over at where Cloak was pointing to see a horde of vampires overtaking a ferry boat docked nearby. People must have been trying to use the ferry to get out of the city, Cloak said. And now they've gone and got themselves trapped on board. Those vamps will eat them alive. We've got to help. Or, Dagger said, we could just hit the throttle, send the whole thing to Staten Island, and call it a night. Cloak looked over at Dagger in disbelief, uncertain whether his partner was joking or not. Either way, he wasn't amused. Instead of dignifying her comment with a response, he rushed towards the ferry to confront the vampires. Keep up, he called back to Dagger. She shook her head and followed Cloak into action. When they boarded the ferry, the pair kicked into full hero mode, picking off the vampires with ease. Dagger manifested short blades of pure light force that she mercilessly thrust into the hearts of the vampires. Cloak used his Dark Force tendrils to grab hold of their fanged foes and hurled them overboard. As Cloak and Dagger fought side by side once more, they both began to remember how much they missed their partnership, and perhaps how much they had taken it for granted. Just when they were starting to finally find their rhythm, though, they reached the ferry's control room and were met by a harsh reality. Inside, there were several human passengers, all huddled together. A group of vampires had them surrounded and looked ready to feast. I've got this, Dagger said, rushing towards the ship's bridge without hesitation. Careful, girl, Cloak said, grabbing a hold of Dagger's wrist for a moment to stop her from leaving. You ask me? This looks like a trap. I didn't ask you, Ty, Dagger snapped back. And if you don't stop babying me, I won't ask you anything ever again. Now let me go. I've got people to save. Cloak released Dagger's wrist and watched as his partner entered the control room. He wanted so badly to protect her, but she was her own hero and she had to make her own choices, for better or for worse. He let out a frustrated sigh and began to follow Dagger into the bridge. But before he could enter, the heavy door that led into her room slammed shut and a vampire locked it from within. Just as Cloak had feared, the vamps had used the innocent passengers to lure the heroes in, and Dagger had taken the bait. There was no escape, no way out, except for one. Coming in, Tandy, Cloak yelled, the fabric of his cape beginning to ripple in an otherworldly breeze. No, don't do it, Dagger commanded. I can handle this. And at first, it looked as though she was right. Tandy fought for her life, hurling her light daggers at the vampires with furious speed, but there were just too many of them. Cloak could only watch through the window in horror as his partner found herself outnumbered, exhausted, and cornered along with the other terrified passengers on the bridge. You gave it your best, Cloak said, opening his cape and tapping into the full power of the Dark Force dimension. Now it's my turn. You can't, Dagger yelled, desperately pushing back another hungry vampire. Remember what Reed said. I don't care what Reed said, Cloak snapped back. All I care about is you. Well, if you teleport, you're going to lose me, Dagger responded. And if I do nothing, I lose you too, Cloak said, knowing full well the gravity of the choice he was about to make. Still, Cloak teleported into the room mere moments before the vampires could sink their teeth into Dagger's flesh. He quickly wrapped his arms around her as the fabric of his cape encircled the other passengers. In a blink, they were all gone. Moments later, Cloak appeared at the Baxter building in a flash of darkness. With him, he brought a small group of relieved strangers who had been snatched from death's door at the last second. But even though the innocent civilians had been saved, someone else had been lost along the way. Cloak looked around frantically. His heart dropped as his worst fears were confirmed. "Don't worry, Ty," Dagger's voice said inside his head. "I'm still here, whether I like it or not." "I'd rather have you mad than dead," Cloak responded, trying not to show his joy at some part of Tandy had survived the encounter. "And you got what you wanted," Dagger sighed. After a long pause, she added, "Thanks, I guess." "I know the darkness has taken its toll on you," Cloak said, "but I'm always going to be here to lead you through it, just like you've always been there to guide me back to the light. That's why you and me are such a good team." "We're a lot more than that," Dagger said, her tone softening for the first time in ages. Ty wished he could look into her eyes and say what was really in his heart, but at that moment, just hearing her voice was enough. It would have to be. With that, his cloak folded in on itself and he vanished from the Baxter building. He was headed back into the night, ready to take on the forces of darkness by himself, but never alone. So yeah, that was the story of A Brief Farewell. That is basically sets up how Cloak and Dagger are the way they are, able to switch between back and forth when you play them. And I have to say, playing them, up to this point, they were my favourite pair. My favourite strategist to date, because Dagger's Light Force daggers literally just allow me to heal allies and damage enemies regardless of where I'm aiming. So I can literally basically just hold down the trigger and just keep throwing out items. And I can do... Actually, when I was playing it, I found I was a fantastic healer. I just hang back, I heal my allies, enforce them, and occasionally, every time I seemed to switch to Cloak, I got KO'd. So I think I prefer playing as Dagger over Cloak, but honestly, this pair is such a good team, and I had a lot of fun playing as these guys. So, thanks for listening. Well, next up on the list is Loki, another strategist. Like and subscribe to enjoy this video, and I'll see you in the next one.